that work was not very widespread because, again, it had not yet been translated. So that idea of deaf pedagogy was not quite as widespread as it is now. So finally, what happened was there was one article that was printed, and that was related to Vygotsky, relating deaf education to Vygotsky. And that happened in volume 2. So it was published in 1985 by Knox and Nelblum. And the two of them gave a presentation at a world conference talking about that deaf pedagogy, how the Vygotsky method and Vygotsky's research was applicable to it. Since then, you would think that there would have been a whole lot more articles that were published, but honestly, there weren't very many. I found Dr. Smagorinsky because I actually was continuing to search to try to find all of the information that I can, what other research was published. But other than Dr. Smagorinsky, there was not much published on this particular topic. So within my 2020 paper, my goal was to begin that discussion, start talking about Vygotsky and how we can provide that context. Now, I want to take a look at some of the terminology that I will be using throughout my presentation from Vygotsky, and then we'll shift over to that modern equivalency. One of those terms that you might see, like I previously mentioned, was defectology. And I propose that it's very similar to our terms that you'll see within special education. You'll also see this in disability studies. So these two terms you will see, you might be familiar with them, but specifically looking at defectology, there's an ongoing problem of a lot of research that was connected to Vygotsky. Now, some people, if you see this term, again, you see it right here, defectology. People can be a little uncomfortable with that term. It feels very exclusive, and that can lead to a lot of misunderstandings. That term is misunderstood by what Vygotsky meant. And so we need to think about how can we reframe that. And so Dr. Smagorinsky will talk about some of the history and talk about Vygotsky and how he kind of cherished this system of how you can inherit those terms, how we see those terms used today. I think it is really important to start to think about how that term was used in the Soviet Union within that time, because Vygotsky had a very specific approach to using that terminology. His language, his concept had a very, very specific meaning, and it was critical to think about how he was utilizing these terminologies. Also, how do we create positive social goals? And that can sometimes feel impossible. Education without positive goals is impossible. So within the field of deaf education, that phrase is really impactful to me because there's so much research that's still ongoing, that still has this very negative connotation of the term defectology. How can that relate to deaf and hard of hearing students? Things that they can't do, for example, things that they are unable to do. We need to fix everything with technology, and we see technology as this kind of miracle cure for the deaf community. And so a lot of us within this field, and hopefully you'll see this later, we're trying to analyze what this term defectology means and what does deaf mean? What is the issue with some of the language that we're using? And we want to make sure we're thinking about the language that we're using, for example, impaired. So I do have one more quick thing, and then we'll hand it over to Dr. Smagorinsky. For example, one time I had a healthcare appointment. I was meeting with my doctor on Zoom. Overall, a great opportunity to be able to talk to my healthcare provider, my healthcare team, having the opportunity to do this remotely, obviously during COVID, something that we're all more familiar with. I went into the waiting room on Zoom. There was an interpreter there with me. I was chatting with my interpreter and just, some general niceties, what's been going on. The two of us knew each other pretty well, just kind of a nice casual conversation. And then another person showed up. I saw the doctor come up onto the screen, which was great, but unfortunately the audio wasn't working, which meant that me and the interpreter were able to communicate fluently through sign language. We didn't have any issues, but my doctor was not able to participate equally within that conversation. In that specific Zoom room, that specific time, the doctor was not, or was the one who was disabled. I was not the one who was disabled because I was able to communicate effectively, whereas the doctor was unable to communicate effectively. And that happens every once in a while. If you're thinking about the Zoom format, you know, everything can kind of be shifted on its head because the environment is so different. When we're thinking about the environment of disability, it can look quite a bit different. I see Dr. Smagorinsky logged off, had to log back on, was struggling with audio, wasn't able to communicate effectively. This is another great example of this. You can see how this concept of disability shows up differently within Zoom. If we were in person, it would look quite a bit different. So this affects our ability to be social with other folks. And so this all relates to my research on Vygotsky. In something else that I have been researching, Vygotsky, again, this book that I had previously shown you that was published back in the 1920s, talks about socio-biological factors. And so that's something that we will be focused on, but I use the term a little bit differently. So if we're talking about biosocial, what I think about is the time for change. We have the ability to change. So biosocial will increase our commonality. What happens? Previously, people would talk about nature, for example, versus nurture, a pretty common debate. But now it seems like maybe some people are separating those concepts, or how we're talking about that is kind of null. You don't see that debate, the nature versus nurture debate, quite as much as you used to. We'll see them. It's not an either or thing. They're not mutually exclusive. We see this more with biosocial. And so I think some concepts are just not well developed quite yet. If we're thinking about power, for example, we're thinking about power and oppression, specifically within the field of deaf education. He's frozen, Amanda.
He is online.
The interpreters were clarifying because it froze for 1 second. So we need to think about power. How is that written about in Vygotsky? How were we talking about that before? And how can we fit the deaf experience into that? The deaf experience is a little bit different than what he was researching. So how can I shift my research to talk about Vygotsky and his approaches and how we can be inclusive within that? But he never seriously talked about power structures. There weren't lots of conversations about how we can change those different inequities. What are the inequities that are faced by deaf students within deaf schools, within other areas that are not education? So that's something that we'll be talking about today. Within this particular text, you'll see lots of different things identified. There are a lot of different conversations that have been had and how we can use this methodological approach, the different methodologies from Vygotsky, and there just aren't very many that we've been able to use so far. So I propose that we use the dialects. That's a relatively well-known, good methodology, but exactly how are we going to do that? How are people able to participate in these experiments? Not quite sure yet. So we need to have control groups, maybe, for example. Did he think about the different ages of deaf students, of deaf folks? He never really talked about in depth how we would use his specific methods. So there are definitely some weaknesses within this particular text, and it's an ongoing process to continue this research and how can we create better understanding, and stronger context. So that's a little bit about my research and a little bit how I've used the Vygotsky method and how I've been able to continue that within my own studies. Now I'm going to, again, I've been working with Dr. Smagorinsky, and we have been working on AAD, which is American Annals of the Deaf. And we have already started to collect quite a bit of research. I want to say we have about 20 proposals. We're trying to get them down to about 6. We are the co-editors of this particular piece. So we're still working on that. Hopefully within this year, maybe next year, 2023, you'll be able to see this work that we've been working on together. And we're hoping that this will help to trigger some more research on defectology and encourage more people to look within this particular field of study. Now, I do want to hand it over to Dr. Smagorinsky, and he will be able to talk a little bit more about that concept of defectology and his particular areas of expertise.
Can anyone hear me? You can hear me? Oh, good. Thank you very much. I had to reboot my computer, and I often have trouble with Zoom when I boot in the first time after when I check in the first time after reboot. So I'm glad we're all in the same meeting. First of all, I always like to thank everyone just for being here. I know you could be doing other things with your morning or afternoon or evening, whatever time it is for you. And it's always an honor that you would join a program that we're on to have a good conversation about things that matter to us. So Michael and I come to this project from very different places, and I think it's useful to know that our orientations are quite different from one another's. I'm not deaf. And in fact, my gateway into Vygotskian defectology wasn't deafness at all. It was kind of accidental, and going and backing into it about a little over 10 years ago, when my family was in quite a bit of a crisis over mental health issues in my daughter, and I've written about her quite a bit, so I'm not exposing anything. I began to realize that when I'd take her to be diagnosed or to be in for meetings with therapists, I couldn't tell whether they were talking about her or me. In other words, the person who was being examined as a mental health case was actually there with another person who should have been analyzed as a mental health case, that being me. And so I learned from all my experiences raising my daughter that she and I are a lot alike. We're both on the autism spectrum. We're both very obsessive compulsive. We both have Tourette's syndrome, and there's something else in there, obsessive compulsive. Oh, we both have extremely high anxiety. And these are all classified as mental illnesses. So I'm a mentally ill person. And I found Vygotsky, I began writing autobiographically in a genre called autoethnography at the encouragement of a friend, because I found that the more I talked to people and kind of confessed or acknowledged that I'm on these various mental health spectra, the more relieved people were, because almost everybody is taking drugs for something. And I take a medication called Paxil every day. If I were to fly to Australia, I'd have to be very loaded up on something called Inderol. If I were to give a speech, if this were an auditorium where I was at a podium and everyone was staring at me and there was a spotlight on me, I would feel very, very anxious, and I would need drugs just to give lots of drugs, lots of Inderol, just to be able to give the talk without having a panic attack. So I share all this with you to let you know that I don't have a passive interest in these issues. I'm very interested in how Vygotsky would explain situations like mine. There's very little about mental health in his writing. And I would just like to return to, Michael pointed out that there were incompletions, and I'm always very sympathetic to a guy who dies when he's 37 and doesn't finish his projects. If I had died at 37, I'd have died with a just completed doctorate. I wouldn't have had the last 30 plus years of a career to develop the ideas, which are still incomplete and under development. And I think it's important if you're a graduate student. I've been trying to understand Vygotsky since about 1990, and Vygotskian and what they call activity theory, historical activity theory. I've been trying to understand this for 30 years with no training. It's something I began after graduate school, where I was trained as a cognitive psychologist, the nature side of the nature-nurture binary. And I would say that that's still alive and well, certainly in reading research. There's something called the science of reading, which is all about the brain. That's all nature, and they don't really care whether you live in a housing project or a palace. It's all inside your head. And so there is, in very critical fields like reading education, the nature-nurture binary is still alive and well. In fact, some colleagues and I just wrote about the problem with binaries in reading research. You either look inside between the ears or out there somewhere, rather than doing what I think Vygotsky did. And the more I've been doing a heavy load reading of Vygotsky. It took me, I spent less than an hour on 5 sentences, as you said you did yesterday. But I have done a reread of the 6 volumes, plus the educational psychology volume, the 8 primitive, and I forget the title, and a lot of other reading. So I've done the last year, I've done another deep dive into Vygotsky, and I'm just
that right here.
Okay, and I'm so impressed with how comprehensive his attention to the human lifespan was. He was, he had a medical background. He's known as a socioculturalist, but he sure did understand the body and the mind and the biological side of life. And it's a really remarkable achievement. And it still blows me away that he died so young and he did so much. It's awesome. It's truly awesome that someone could have this brilliant a career in such a short period of time, and then left so much for the rest of us to do. That's what we get to do, is we get to finish up his projects, or at least try to build on them. So as I said, my interest is in my gateway was mental health. But then I'm actually not really, I would say I don't think that the critical disability field would accept me as one of their own. I'm actually an old English teacher, literature, composition, and language. I was a high school teacher, and literacy education has been probably what most people would think of me as doing, along with maybe teacher education. And then in the last decade, I've opened up my understanding to this really impressive volume on defectology. If you haven't read it, I avoided it because I hated the title, the way a lot of people do. I was actually in Moscow, close to 30 years ago, and we went to a defectological institute. And I was wondering, why are they taking us to this place with this awful name? And we didn't really see enough of its operation to understand what they were doing. So I was no better off for having been there. But when I began to read it at the recommendation of someone, I thought, this may well be the most important thing he ever did. The defectology volume is just fantastic, I think. And I can tell you what I think I know. And what I think I know changes a lot, because I keep reading and thinking and talking and engaging with people. One of the things that I've really been impressed by in all this rereading is the importance of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the Hegelian dialectic, because this is a chance where we can talk with each other. And I was on a program, a Zoom program out of Brazil not long ago, where my co-presenter couldn't listen and kept saying she was an expert and kept undermining what I was saying in the chat box, not in a productive way. I welcome disagreement, but I don't think it's very productive when people don't listen. And the idea of being a listener as well as a speaker seems to be central if you're going to fruitfully participate in this kind of dialectic. And so I'm very happy to be in a program where that appears to be the value. So what I was really struck by in reading the defectological work was the emphasis on the rest of us. And so I suspect that Michael's interest in deaf education is how we can educate deaf people about their engagements with the world. And you can correct me if I'm misunderstanding you, Michael. Where my reading of Vygotsky is, how can the rest of us get educated about the lives of people who are different from ourselves? And it applies not just to deafness. It applies to, I think that you can extrapolate to mental health. You can extrapolate to other bodily, in some of this work, I've called it departures from the evolutionary norm. It's very hard to come up with a term that's not like disabling. And a lot of the language in even disability studies, you're using a word that that positions people in a subordinate role, I think. And so I prefer, it is a departure from the evolutionary norm. Evolution has not produced an abundance of deaf people. It's actually probably something that's become possible through the advancement of civilizations, that we can do a better job of supporting people who couldn't hear the animals sneaking up on them, in prehistoric times. So the emphasis, I think, is so compelling that part of deaf education is all about the people who can hear. How can we teach you how can this phenomenon of deafness be better understood so that deaf people are treated with all the dignity, all the respect, all the appreciation as people who can hear? And there's a term there's a study that I'm doing with one of my doctoral students, Merida Lang, on a university class where what we are calling audio norms. And I don't know, Michael, I want to run this term past you because I don't know if it's very good or not, but we're trying to think, I don't like the expression hearing people. It's awkward. And so we thought, well, what's a different term? And audio norm was something that occurred to us. It may be a worse term, I don't know. But it's people for whom hearing is the norm, an audio norm. And audio norms,
Yeah, actually,
what?
Could I jump in there?
Oh yeah, please do.
We do talk about phonocentric. I think that would be a good term. It's folks who do focus more on that audio aspect.
That's I'm open to anything. It's a working term for us. And so, but what is it? How can we educate everybody else? And Vygotsky says this sort of thing throughout the volume, and I think he uses blindness more than deafness in that volume. Blindness is not a problem for the people who can't see. It's a social problem. It's a problem that the rest of us have created, because if you're born blind, you don't know the difference. You don't feel disabled. It's your world. It's what you know. But it's the rest of us who don't get it, who need to be educated. And Michael, that's the tack we're taking. It's really not looking at deaf people. We're looking at audio norms or audiophonic, whatever the other term we just heard was. That is where the
not audiophonic. I said phonocentric.
Phonocentric. Okay. How can we create educational programs that don't diminish people who are different from what are considered the normative population? So I don't really know. I've been in. I was on a work group that included several deaf people and translators, and I had to learn the various etiquettes. For instance, if we were in a room together when, say, Emily was speaking while Michael was signing, there's a tendency to look at the place where the sound is coming from, but the etiquette is to look at the person signing, even though the sound is coming from over there somewhere. And they're just different. There are different etiquettes that you have to learn when you're in a deaf environment. So that's how I come to this. You know, I appreciate the opportunity to work with Michael, because it's taking my understandings into a field that I don't know well, but that he does, and that I'm hoping that my reading of Vygotsky and the Vygotskian literature has some benefit to the work that he's building. So if we have a monitor,
absolutely.
Okay. So if we have a monitor, help us know what the next step is. Should we go to the chat box and look at questions? Is that the procedure here?
This is Michael. I think the basic structure has 3 parts. One being just an overview of both of our research, and then going more in depth on the analysis. And the final one being more of a dialogue with some questions. I do have some questions ready to pose in the chat, but I would also like to add just a couple of points and maybe have some back and forth, and then we could go on to questions if that's all right. There are 2 points that I would like to make to start off with. And the first is very basic. The second is a bit more complex. I'll go with the basic one first. We talked a bit about terms that we use, and your paper back in 2012, I have it right here in front of me. You used the term extra normative. And I liked that term. I think that I'll actually use that term moving forward, because I like how it really can be understood by educators. I talk to my future educators about that basic concept. In basic statistics, we do use something that we call normal distribution, right? We've all heard about that, the typical bell curve. You've got your normal distribution. And in the middle of that, you've got the average. And then you've got standard deviations going out. But again, in that middle, it's the average, it's the largest number. And it goes down from that into either direction, approaching infinity, or approaching 0 rather. And then everything within that is the range, of course. And that is considered normal. And I think that's a beautiful metaphor for what Vygotsky was trying to argue in his work. Students who are deaf-blind might be further into those outliers, but they're still considered normal. And maybe we could borrow Dr. Smagorinsky's term. Again, it was extra normal. And I liked that term a lot. And I'm trying to think of it within the normal distribution of the human species and diversity that we all have. And I've been thinking about deaf students, blind students, students with multiple disabilities as not necessarily being less than other humans, but rather a different type of human, a different form. So still under that normal bell curve, just not the average. Again, I really liked that idea. So that was the first, more basic one. The second, again, is going to be a bit more complex. Part of my dissertation research was focused on a concept that I call decensus, essentially having a disagreement about a specific topic and why we have differing values and different values within a system. My current theory within deaf education has been a lot of ongoing conflicts when it comes to decensus. And one example of that is if there's a parent who has a deaf child, they might know nothing about deafness. They might not know anything about that experience. It wouldn't resonate with them. The child and the parent are then dissensus. And it's more than just that. So within my research and teaching in general, there are many different desensual characteristics, specifically within deaf education. And many educators want their students to essentially become the norm, to speak, to hear like a regular hearing child. But deaf children might disagree with that. They are signing folks often. They don't want to use spoken language. They are different. And then there is that give or take because of it. And that's something that we really have to focus on. We can't not focus on it because it's really the center of deaf education. And sometimes there are educators out there or stakeholders within education who just want us all to pretend that everything is the same, but that really violates the rule of the ongoing cycles within deaf education. And many of the problems that do exist lead to crises, and those continue to happen. They aren't solved because they continue, and we don't do anything to break them down. Vygotsky did do quite a bit of research on a very similar topic, and there's one wonderful case study. He started looking into signed languages and how they could be harmful or hurtful to deaf children. And then there was a complete 180 shift. At the end of his career, he believed that sign language was necessary for deaf children. And that in and of itself was a dissensus. And I think it's really cool to see how that shift happened and occurred throughout even this one volume. You can see where he started to change and then where the shift really did happen. And that has caused me personally to think about, the fact that if Vygotsky could go from one belief to the opposite belief, that the rest of us around the world can do the same thing. And I think for myself, I've had several conversations now with Dr. Smagorinsky, and we've talked about how there are different spheres of impact from Vygotsky into the rest of the world now, and how now being able to bring so many folks to the table for a variety of discussions is wonderful. So again, that was two different concepts, one on dissensus and those conflicts, and the other on the concept of norms or normal. Dr. Smagorinsky, did you want to say anything, follow up to that? If yes, great. If not, we can go ahead and go into some discussion questions.
So just briefly, I appreciate anyone using a term I developed. So extra normal, that's one person who now uses it besides me. But I actually been through so many changes or revisions of what's the best terminology to use. For instance, and keep in mind my entry point is autism. And there's a book about neurodiversity that by a man named Silverman or Silverberg, and he he made the term popular, neurodiversity. What I then realized that it was being applied to any point of human difference, and it became utterly meaningless. And so I've actually backed off using neurodiversity in mental health discussions. And I kind of like extra normal. And David Kellogg put in the chat box that Vygotsky's term was anomalous. I actually think, David, that the terms are a little different, because I used extra normal because it kind of gives a little spice. It gives it makes it's a characterization that makes the person more special than aberrant, or anomalous is not typical, atypical. And so I think that the term has a more positive connotation than anomalous. And this is another limitation of mine, because I don't speak Russian. And David, I know your Russian is strong, but I just don't know the Russian, so I don't know what the term he used when he used anomalous. But that's the translation that I see throughout that volume. And anybody can jump in and help out in this, because as you can see, my thoughts keep. I hope they keep developing in a positive direction based on conversations I have and additional reading that I do. But one thing I don't consider myself is an expert. I think expertise is a dead end. People stop growing once they call themselves experts. And this last year, I think I've advanced my understanding quite a bit. And I don't see how I could possibly be an expert if I question what I knew very recently, or what I thought I knew. So I'd like to just welcome people to chime in. And here, there's more in the chat box. Calls autism a superpower. It can be. I've actually written about something I call my Aspergers Advantage, because Asperger's is thought to be I've seen it described as a disability. I'm a disabled person because I'm on the autism spectrum. And I fight back against that. It can be, but I think that everything is situational.
Yeah,
okay.
Dr. Smagorinsky, that heavily relates to the concept of deaf gain, I would say. It's a similar path where you're going with, the benefits, thinking of the Asperger's privilege or the Asperger's benefit.
Yes, but the Asperger's Advantage is the term I've used, and it's really the confluence of Asperger's obsessive compulsiveness and anxiety, high anxiety that I have to be medicated for, because they make you really focused. And if you're going to be an academic, it's a good bundle of traits to have, because you can go into detail, you don't get distracted, you're in it to, for the long run. You can do really detailed work that other people find very boring. And I consider it advantageous as a researcher. They're not necessarily good traits to have in many social situations. So it's all situated, whether you are disabled or enabled. And one of the examples I've given that people seem to relate to is that blindness is typically viewed as a disability. But if you're in a room and all the lights go out and there's no light in the room, the only person who's not disabled is the blind person. So it's situational, whether you're disabled or enabled by how you're built. And so if loud screeching noises came and made all this, Michael be fine. The rest of us would be disabled. And so I can't emphasize enough. I think I'm right on this one. The notion of disabled is not uniform. And John has entered something in the chat box about a Game of Thrones scene where disability was the enabler.
All right. So one thing that I do want to add and catch up in on the chat is you can see a few people mentioned the deaf Advantage as well. We actually already have a book that's been published called Deaf Gain, Raising the Stakes for Human Diversity. This is not something that I published, but it was written by an excellent scholar. If you hear that term, see that term about deaf gain or deaf advantage, this is a great place to start looking at that. It's a really important shift in how we think about deaf people and how we think about the deaf community. And so I do want to pay attention to time. So I think that this is the perfect opportunity to move on to the third part of our workshop and have that discussion. We do have 4 talking points. We're not limited to these particular talking points. They're just something that we brainstormed and we think would be a good jumping off point within our fields and within our expertise. So I want people to be able to jump in where they can. If it's something you're not interested in, we want to talk about something else, that's totally fine. And we're more than willing to do that. And so one thing I do want to share with you is that I think it would be a great idea to start thinking about the different ways and different ideas that we can have to help continue this discussion and help all be a part of it. So I did post our different talking points and our questions within the chat if you would like to take a look there. The first one is, how do professionals understand and balance autonomy/agency with responsibility and accountability in the deaf education? The second one is, when we're considering effective practices in deaf research and deaf pedagogy, what do differing intellectual traditions or paradigms provide? Our third question, to what degree do you consider deafness to be a quote unquote problem? And if so, whose problem is it? And what type of problem is it? And then our final question is, what creates harm as well as what reduces harm? What would increase benefits and what would decrease benefits in deaf education? So those are the things that we considered focusing on for the rest of our session. I know it's a lot of questions. We're already at 4:48 Australian time. I'm not exactly sure what time it is there, but over here it's 4:48. So I think if we spend a little bit of time on each one, I just want to make sure we're able to have that conversation, and then we will be able to think about it and have that conversation together.
If I could add,
We're going to take a few minutes to think first.
and if I could maybe just add something to Michael's introduction while we're thinking. But again, he and I approach it, I think Michael approaches it from the standpoint of the deaf person and the deaf person's education. And my own interest is the other side of that coin, which is the social environment created by other people. And so there are 2 types of education at work here. One is what we consider deaf education, that is how do deaf people, I assume this is it, Michael, how do deaf people learn best, or what educational program best serves the interests of the deaf learner. And the other side of it is, how do educators more broadly create better environments so that the rest of us aren't so ignorant and mean and unsympathetic toward the needs of deaf people. And that's something that I'm learning about and that I'm studying in university students, discussing one book called Bug, which is written by a deaf man. So I guess the question is, does anyone want to jump into to Michael's questions, the ones that Michael put in the chat box, or to take us, to return to any points that we've made prior to this?
David, I see something you want to share.
Yeah, I want to start with the last question, what creates harm and what increases benefits? And the reason is, I'd like to hear from both Michael and Peter about the nature-nurture divide in the form of defining the biosocial as the technical fix, like cochlear implants for deaf people, which was a big deal when I studied phonology. And in Peter's case, attenuating medicines, and medicines for attenuating anxiety and so on and so forth. So you've got sort of biological solutions on the one hand, and then you've got this other solution, which I interpret from Michael's view, work, and also from Peter's work, which is defining the defective, the group that is the extra normal community as a speech community. That is to say, deaf people are an obvious speech community. It is essentially what's happening in a lot of deaf education is essentially what happened with bilingual education in the 1960s, where you had bilinguals moving from a group that was seen as being defective to a group that's seen as being in some ways extra normal. And that part of it is it seems to me we're getting back to the nature-nurture problem, where nature is the biological approach, the cochlear implant and the drug approach, and nurture is organizing the extra normal group as a community, as a speech community in particular. It's interesting that Stokoe speculates that the first human languages were sign languages and not spoken languages. I don't know if this is really speculation. It's intrinsic in a lot of what Vygotsky writes about gesture. And you can certainly see it in very young children, that their first attempt to open the door of language is a gesture and not a sound, very often.
So David, were you asking, Michael, okay, Michael wants to come in. Was that, so that was directed to the two of us, although I would like to see the floor as open as possible. Well, go ahead, Michael. I didn't see you when I started talking, so go ahead.
Sure. So there are a lot of different things that we should be considering within the field of deaf education. If we're thinking about values, for example, but the idea that deaf people can be quote unquote fixed or remedied or cured through the use of cochlear implants or hearing aid is a false concept. There can definitely be benefits from those technologies, or there could be harm reduction coming from those technologies in some ways. But I think many of us have the assumption that we just are looking at this through a normative lens. So for example, we're kind of assuming that, well, we are taking the position and assuming that deaf people want to become like hearing people who use spoken language. And often that's not the case. We also might make the assumption that later on, if somebody is quote unquote fixed, you can erase the effect from their deafness if they were to have an implant later on, for example. And so thinking about deafness and thinking about the deaf experience, there are a lot of positive benefits for many people. Literally, I'm pointing back to my Deaf Gain book over here, but there are a lot of advantages to the deaf experience. So once we take away that benefit, what's going to happen? If we're thinking about Peter in his case, if we were to take away his autism diagnosis, and we wouldn't be left with Peter still, likely. We would be left with a completely different person. So we need to look at the bigger picture and thinking about the nature-nurture divide, my belief is that within psychology, there's a specific outcome that we need to be thinking about. So once we start changing biology, changing the social environment, we need to think about how those are interacting to create that person.
So thanks. That Michael's comments resonate with my perspective, and I want to give this is anecdotal, it's hardly research, but this work group that I was in that included 2 deaf participants, along with sign translators, and other people who I forget the name of the term, but were a hearing person who was the child of deaf parents. I forget the name for it, but I had a lot.
That's a CODA. It's a child of deaf
CODA,
adult,
right.
so it's not a CODA. CODA.
Thank you. And I was in an unfamiliar sort of discursive environment, not just with the signing, but I was learning new perspectives. And so I'm a hearing person, right? I've never had deafness issues. I don't know what I would do in a world without music, for instance. There are certain sounds that have infused my life for many years, and I would have a hard time doing without them. And I have had, at points in my life, I have been puzzled by why someone wouldn't want to be able to hear. So this is a developmental story, because I'm better now. I understand better now, but I was part of the environment that I now recognize as discriminatory and insensitive. And the points that the deaf people were making in that room were, if you tell me that I'm missing out because I can't hear, that is a form of colonization that I resent and reject. And it was very emphatic. They were happy with who they were. They were happy with how they lived. They were happy with how they had a sensory engagement with their environments. And I realized that I was part of the colonizing, debilitating environment of one that thought, well, your life would be a whole lot better if you could hear like me. And it's a hard realization to understand that you were part of the problem. And this is not that long ago. I was over 60 years old, but I'd never thought about it before. I'd never thought about life as a deaf person. I'd never thought about why you wouldn't want to hear, but I had to listen to my colleagues in those meetings and try to take their point of view. And this is something, one of the characteristics of being autistic is that you don't have natural empathy. I can't feel what other people feel. I can't do it, but I can very deliberately try to take their point of view by listening and trying to reconstruct for myself what that life would be like. And that's what, so it wasn't empathy that made me more appreciative of the life that they liked living. It was perspective taking. It was a perspective, kind of a cognitive perspective taking activity that I put myself through that forced me to be a better listener and try to understand better.
Can I continue the issue of technology that David raised? Because I think it's really thinking about our relationship technology and deafness or any other areas is actually quite important. One of the joys that I have when I'm working with Michael is the fact that I feel, and also, I mean, this also applies when I'm working with David and Suyang and Hongji, is that there is a language there, there's an ability there that I do not have. There's a whole area that I have kind of a vague access to, but it really unsettles me in a really nice way. And I was just reflecting on the fact that when I work with my friends who are blind, I don't feel quite as unsettled with my lack of access to Braille. I mean, Braille does have a number of advantages. And one of the advantages is in the choir I sing in, the blind member can actually sit up, sing out in a way that I'm not able to when I'm having to look down at the scores, because she can just read it straight away. And there's a number of, you know, again, when I'm out with other blind friends, and they're using, you know, sonar or various other ways of understanding, they get an access to the world that I don't have. I mean, they don't have, but there's kind of an interesting sense in which it's not a language community, but a technology that is giving different understanding to the world. And these are technologies that we're interacting with all the time and developing and redeveloping. And so it's not a static world. It's something we're continually changing with. I mean, I interact with Michael largely through text, as I do with almost all of my academic colleagues. And so it's almost, you know, it's seamless. There's no difference in a sense that I feel within the kind of depth of access. But the kind of technologies that we're having and the kind of ways that that's happening is changing continuously. So I think there's a responsibility on us to theorize and to think about how this is happening and the ways in which we take control of those technologies, so that they are, as Michael points out, going to be empowering rather than disempowering, that they're going to open up the possibilities rather than close them down. I think it's a really interesting thing to think about, but I don't have any particular solutions there, but I'm interested in how people are starting to think about technologies within this area, because it's part of all our experience.
Right. I do actually want to build on that a little bit. I think it's a bit of a risk of, let me make sure I'm wording this correctly. There are some deaf individuals who are resistant to some technologies, but that doesn't mean that deaf folks are technology phobic by any means. Historically, there have been changes to technology for deaf folks more than to most other groups. So, for example, the original modem was invented by a team with a deaf individual. Paul Thaler was one of the folks who invented the modem. And originally, the first texting system was developed to actually have communication and conversation between deaf and non-deaf folks. And that happened actually over in Finland with the Nokia company. And there are many, many technological advances and inventions that were originated by deaf folks, or at least popularized by deaf folks. When COVID hit, there was a lot of shift to Zoom, and many of us thought about deaf education and how it was going to be disrupted. But deaf folks are already so experienced when it comes to video technology. We already know how to do it and what to do. Many signs for ASL, at least, shifted once folks moved to Zoom or to remote communication. And I think a lot of those changes and adaptations have come from the technology and what we would at least consider technology. So cochlear implants, for example, hearing aids, things like glasses, things like wheelchairs. There are so many things that essentially become extensions of the body. And essentially, they are the body. I consider these glasses to be a part of me. And many of you who have something, some sort of device that you use constantly day in and day out, probably consider that to be a part of you as well. Many, for example, of us have our phones here, and those are extensions of our mind, of our bodies. If we lose one of those things, it's essentially like we've lost our head. And I think deaf folks tend to use technology in many of the same ways. But the big fear out there is if there's a cochlear implant or a hearing aid that would replace sign language. That is the fear, more than being afraid of the technology itself, but rather the fear that the culture, the language, the history of deaf folks will be erased as well. And I think going back to Vygotsky would empathize with that thought process. The language, the culture, the history that unites us across the world is truly a united front, and we can't lose that. We can't afford to lose that. And then going back into technology, that's another huge part of it. You've got language, culture, history, and nowadays we have technology, or even going back, we have tools. What tools become what we are and who we are. So I don't necessarily want to perpetuate the idea that deaf folks are afraid or hate technology, but rather what can come of or as a result of that technology.
So thank you. That's all. I appreciate that, Michael. I want to provide, I guess we would call a historicized question for Michael. Because as I understand it, whether you're born deaf or whether you go deaf produce different desires, perhaps. People who lose hearing might be more inclined to want to restore it in some way. Whereas people who are born deaf, that's their world. And from Vygotsky's development of defectology, I think this is really fascinating historically, because this idea actually originated in Germany, but became very important in the late Russian Empire and early Soviet Union, because there were so many wars. So there was a failed Russian Revolution in 1905 after a loss to Japan in a war. Within a decade, there was World War I. During World War I, there was a Bolshevik revolution in Russia that eventually produced the Soviet Union, but not before several years of civil war. And so you had a part of the world where there had been a lot of bombs dropped. There were a lot of children who were deaf, who went deaf during these wars, who went blind, who became cognitively impaired because of the violence of war. And part of the task of the Soviet Union was to introduce a mass education system designed to socialize people into the Soviet ideals. And part of this program, one of the admirable parts of that program was to attend to all these kids who'd gotten, had their senses blown off during the wars, I should say, because there were many of them. And so these were for the most part, I would say, the formal Soviet defectology schools were designed for people who had lost their sight and lost their hearing and lost the biological cognitive inheritance. And so there must be a difference between someone like that and someone born with the same conditions. And that's an assumption I'm working from, but it would help if you could clarify for me.
Yes, thank you for that historical context. I think that is important. In one of my publications, I do think it would be a good addition to this workshop. And we focused on different groups of deaf people. And sometimes deaf researchers have a tendency, I guess, to really lump it all together. You've got late deafened folks born deaf, all lumped into the greater concept of deaf folks and were discussed as one group. Then you've got hard of hearing as well, lumped into an even larger group. And I do support that to some degree. I also think that it's essentially like a big camp of deaf folks. We've got what we call little d deaf for a reason, and being inclusive of all of the different types of deafness and deaf people, because there really are many similarities. And I think the similarities are important to recognize. But at the same time, there are fundamental differences that we need to recognize as well. And the needs of an individual who is born hearing and then loses their hearing later in life can be different than the needs of an individual who never heard anything. And there is an axiom in deaf education that needs to be updated, I believe, for some new realizations. And one example of that is an old quote from an individual named I. King Jordan. And what I. King Jordan said was that deaf people can do anything except hear. And that is a nice quote. It sounds nice. It's impactful. It was said in the 1980s. It was sophisticated. But at the same time, we have deaf folks who can hear now. We have deaf folks who are born deaf and get an implant as early as 1 month old. And the needs of those folks are different than folks who are deafened at 85 years old. The needs of folks who are 85, the elders who are in late stages of life, are going to be different than early childhood methodologies and pedagogies that we are focusing on now. And we need to have a better idea of what the commonalities are as well as the differences. So if you go historically into this, there are some similarities. If you've got individuals like you were mentioning who became disabled from war, we see many of those same things happening now. We've got immigrants coming in from a variety of communities who are leaving their countries. And now we've got postmodern capitalism that's really in decay. And neoliberal environmental politics are really impacting so many communities. And we are having a diaspora again, just like happened back in Vygotski's time. So I think historically, we need to be creative at how we're looking at one lump sum of people, those people in this context being deaf. And actually, just to respond to what Patricia said in the chat, I think I would like to build on what Patricia said. I do understand that and want to add a little bit more to it as well. There are many risks involved with cochlear implant surgeries that many medical providers do not talk about. One of them being, if you have brain surgery, they open your scalp to implant the device, and that device destroys the cochlea. What that means is we essentially are trying to go in to fix, and in some ways, they do fix something while also destroying something else. So there are individuals who get cochlear implants early, and they aren't necessarily able to take advantage of the newer technologies as they come. There have been improvements made over time, but the early adopters of cochlear implants are stuck with the third, fourth generation of the technology. And there aren't many clinicians that talk about those risks. Another risk, if you have a cochlear implant, is you cannot have an MRI. And for many folks with complex health needs, that's a no-go, myself included. And we have to consider how ethically sticky some of these technologies can be and are, not just in a social context, but in a medical context as well. And when we talk about early childhood education, it becomes even more complicated. When we talk about the socio-cultural aspect, we can't ignore it. And that's major. The impacts on the deaf community around the globe happen in a variety of ways. In the US, ASL is the dominant language for the deaf community, but ASL can sometimes end up really taking over and essentially colonizing some other languages that are then used less and less, or told that what they are using is incorrect. We've got deaf Americans who have the idea of wanting to help, and that can be good in some ways. But again, then when you bring ASL, you also end up colonizing and taking over those local languages that in some situations are now erased because ASL has taken over. Another example, in the Caribbean, there are many languages and many dialects, and many of those dialects of sign language, there are dialects, there are accents, and the more we see ASL or deaf Americans coming in, the less we're seeing those dialects and accents. So just a few different examples for you to ponder. I see John just made a point in the chat, and that's great as well. Great point. Even though we share English, Australia and the US, the sign languages are not the same.
So, Michael, I'm just curious then. There's a lot about how it's been pretty well established, I think, that languages embody ideologies, that, discourse is fundamentally ideological. Would you say that that's also true of different sign languages, that they have different ideologies embedded in them?
The short answer is yes, definitely. There's a scholar, Tim Regan, who is an expert in that particular topic, works at the University of Maine, I believe. There's some other publications on that from another person who works, I want to say, in Scotland at the University of Edinburgh. I'm not exactly sure on that second one, but both of them focused on the ideology of language, specifically related to signed languages. So we have primarily focused on our last question. We do have 3 other questions if we want to take a look at any of those. I guess we did touch on the third one as well, but so far not too much talk on question number 1 and number 2. We do have about 10 minutes left before people have to go run off, do whatever they have to do. I also have to teach tonight. So if there's anybody who would like to add thoughts on the first 2 questions that I posted in the chat.
So, Michael, maybe it would help when I see how do professionals understand and balance who are these professionals? Could you clarify the referent for professionals?
I left it open-ended to your interpretation. So it could be whoever you are thinking within that particular referent. Who do you view as a professional? A professional could be a doctor, could be somebody involved in your medical care team, somebody involved within the field of deaf mental health. It could be an educator, could be an administrator at a school for the deaf. Really, I'm leaving that term open-ended intentionally. Could be an audiologist. There are a lot of different examples that I think would fill or would fit to that concept of professional for this question.
So, and then I'm going to skip to the second one. And if anyone is welcome to displace me, I've had a lot of floor space here. But the second question, I think we've kind of touched on, but I think is important when considering effective practices in deaf research and pedagogy. What do differing intellectual traditions or paradigms provide? What we've been tasked with here is to present what you might call a sociocultural or Vygotskian or defectological paradigm for thinking about deafness, what it is, deaf education, what that is, what the social challenge is for hearing people, audio norms. But I assume that there are probably other paradigms that would, well, for instance, I know that one of the critiques in disability studies of special education is that it works from medical models that are pathologizing, right? It assumes the difference and deficiency of people whose bodies operate differently from evolutionary norms. So and those can be considered colonizing and harmful, right? What do different traditions provide? I think that there's a question also in here somewhere about harm. I think that some could be interpreted as providing harmful interventions for people more psychologically and emotionally than physically. So, and again, I'm working from a limited knowledge base, but would Michael or anyone care to speak to the different paradigms? Because I don't know the field of deaf education. I know that's Michael's field, but I really don't know enough about everybody else's backgrounds to consider who else might contribute to that. But I'd be interested in hearing kind of what the major paradigms are. I don't think Vygotskian defectology is at the top of a lot of lists, at least here in the United States. I mean, sometimes when I've written for the public, I get accused of being a Marxist, and boy, that is bad here in the US. So what I'm wondering is what else is available from what we've tried to talk about here today?
David's got his hand up, so I might call on him. And then I might actually ask Janine to chime in, because she's made some comments about material culture in the chat that I think would be nice for her to expand on. So just giving you a fair warning, Janine. David? You're muted, so we're not going to hear you.
Looking forward to that too, John, because I've had a little too much floor space, including in the chat box. But I here in South Korea, this addresses all three questions. Here in South Korea, I'm required to upload what I'm going to do to increase the autonomy and agency for all of the disabled people, the extra normal people that I teach. And this is always ironic because I have the worst Korean language skills of anyone in the class, and everybody else speaks Korean much better than I do. So I'm always slightly amused, and I say that everyone, but particularly the professor, should be considered pre-abled rather than disabled. I think that one of the risks that we have in understanding and balancing autonomy and agency is the tendency, which Vygotsky does not suffer from, to miss the class dimension of extra normal communities. Here in Korea, deaf people are poor. They tend to run very small shops. They tend to sell kimbap on the street. They sell tteokbokki to little children outside schools, and they are an economic underclass. We had a thriving community of deaf people right down the street from here. They were all evicted, thrown out by a major real estate development because of the real estate price explosion here in Seoul. And so it seems to me that what's missing from deaf education in South Korea is precisely Marxism. It's precisely the ability to understand it as a class problem. It's not a question, it's a comment. Sorry.
Thanks for that, David. Janine, do you want to, can I tempt you to turn on your microphone?
Thanks, John. Apologies for the video not working, everyone. Freund was talking about the material culture, and for a classroom situation, which I am most familiar with in a secondary setting, this can incorporate everything from situational seating plans to computers, to recordings, to devices that are used within a classroom. And whilst incorporation of these may be enabling for some students, they may actually introduce an element of disconnect for other students. And so when you consider the deaf community, I think my example was for a new teacher who is not aware of the best or the adjustments that would be best supportive of particular students, they would seat a student where the teacher was enabled rather than the student. So for the work that is currently being done by Dr. Smagorinsky and Michael Schuyler, this raises the awareness and the understanding that the lens with which we can view should be from the students as well. What is best going to be the adjustments for them to increase their access to all the learning activities? The universal design that we implement at school is one of the current pushes that we have in secondary school. And that it's not just universal design, but it will also need to be uniquely tailored for adjustments for specific students. If you want the link for Freund, I can put that up on the chat.
Definitely, that is a great point.
Thank you.
And just 1 minute, I know we don't have a whole lot of time left, but if I could just add one thing to that as kind of a follow-up. If we're thinking about universal design learning, there's a big push in education and within disability studies to focus on that. But also we need to think about the individual, just like you mentioned. It's critical to think about them. When we are advocating for them, we need to think about not just universal design. We have design that is individual as well. And this is kind of a different theory that we're thinking of. So we do need to support one community, obviously, but that can be beneficial to other communities as well. But this is relatively new. We've been so focused on universal design, but how can we do that to support the disability community internationally? And this does require a lot of images, for example. We might need to think about the use of color. And that's something that I was kind of like, wow, I feel like I've been thinking about this all wrong. Maybe I've been using pictures for everything, but maybe it doesn't work for this one specific community. So we do just need to rethink what our plans are, I need to rethink my own pedagogy because I have deaf blind students, for example. And if they're coming to my lecture, if I have all of these different images, universal design is great in theory, but we need to make sure that we are catering our particular pedagogy to the individual as well. And so one thing within my dissertation and the research that I've been doing is to try to take a look at that. How can we create this equity within an educational environment? It's kind of like a staircase. We're thinking of 3 different steps. And at first I was walking around, you know, you walk up the stairs, not a big deal, don't think anything of it. And this is literal in my particular place of work. I'm able-bodied. I don't have any issues. I walked up, no issues. Then I had some other students who were able to come in, no issues. Everyone came in. And then there was, again, these 3 steps. I saw a student with a wheelchair and I was like, well, I guess this student is not able to access this particular part of the classroom. There was no ramp. There was no consideration for this one student who was a wheelchair user. So they were also a deaf student. And then later on, we did have some different activities within our classroom. We had some partner activities as well as some small group activities. And I realized that this one student was going to affect how I was going to teach my class because I needed it to be equitable. If they were not able to get up into this space, I needed to change my approach. So how do I cater my teaching to these individuals? And that's something that we do need to restructure. Some of those restructuring decisions are relatively easy, but we need to make sure that people are able to participate. And that's not their responsibility. This is the environment that is hurting this one particular student. And so in my naivety, I didn't really realize this until something came up. So thinking about universal design or universal design learning, we need to think about who is included within that particular design. And these sorts of issues will continue to come up.
Thanks so much, Michael. It's been a absolutely stunning session. I've enjoyed it so much and actually learned so much. So if you'd like to put your hands together or put those little virtual hands up or things like that, for Michael and Peter, it's been a great session. Enjoyed it. I'll put up within the folders all of the papers that have been put up, and clearly this has been recorded, not the very first part of it, at least we got it right after a little while. And as usual, it's been an absolutely stunning collaboration. And I think that's actually an important point. One of the areas I dabble in is science communication, and one of the movements in the way we think about science communication has been from transmission to thinking about your audience and you know, transmitting to a particular, you know, changing what you do to the audience, to actually thinking about it as collaboration. And I think that's in answer to, or a response to question 1, I think the idea of a collaboration rather than you know, professionals interacting with clients is the way that we need to think about this. And it's the way certainly we work in academia. So I think it's a very powerful way. But thank you, Michael and Peter. It's been absolutely fantastic. We'll have a half-hour break and then we're returning with Nikolai's session on cultural historical methodology, which I'm sure everybody is waiting for. But yeah, thanks so much.
Oh, John, is Nikolai's talk going to be available on YouTube or something for those of us who
yes,
can't?
As long as I succeed in recording it, we will be putting it up on our YouTube channel. So we haven't quite got around to doing that for yesterday, but we'll do it over the next couple of days and have them up. And we'll distribute all the relevant links and whatever through the list that we have. So everybody who's in our participant list and also presenting will get access to, and we'll also put it up within the folder that we've got all of the readings and everything.
Okay, so I just want to let Nikolai know that I look forward to seeing the talk, although I'm not, this is the end of my day and I'm
yes, I realize that, yeah.
So thank you.
Even worse for those in Europe and Africa at the moment. They're, which, you know, you noticed that Katerina was with us this morning, very late for her. So it has been centered around the Asia Pacific, and we have called it the Asia Pacific Historical Activity Research Summer School for a reason. But it's amazing the participation that we get from all across the world. So it's wonderful, and it will be watched by people. So thanks so much.
I'd just like to add to the point in the chat box. Without Emily, our sign interpreters, we wouldn't have this session. And you've really done a terrific job. So thank you very much.
Yeah, Emily and Jenna, thanks very much. It's been. I was thinking all the time.
Thank you for your support, interpreters.
All the time I was sitting here saying, how can I get a technological fix that puts Emily and Jenna at the center, rather than, the person who's speaking coming up, you come up, which actually is up at the moment for me because I'm speaking, but which is the way it should be. And it's actually a simple bit of coding that I can click on that screen and always have it as the correct. But anyway, we'll work on these things. It's amelioration rather than revolution.
All right.
Okay.
We're all set. I wanted to say thank you to everyone. Thanks again. Have a wonderful rest of your morning. And for me here in Rochester, as well as those other folks in the United States, have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily.